How Young Thug went from rap superstar to courtroom. One of hip-hop's biggest stars spent over 2 years fighting one of the most controversial criminal cases in music history. This is the story of Young Thug's RICO trial. In May 2022, one of the most influential musicians in modern hip-hop was arrested outside his own home in Atlanta. Within hours, the news had traveled across the world. A Grammy winner, a chart-topping artist, a man who had helped shape the sound of an entire generation of rap music. And now, he was facing charges that could put him behind bars for the rest of his life. What followed would become the longest criminal trial in the history of the state of Georgia, a 2.5-year legal battle involving 28 defendants, hundreds of witnesses, a recused judge, an arrested defense attorney, and a courtroom drama so unpredictable that even seasoned legal experts struggled to keep up. This is the story of how a record label became the center of a criminal racketeering case. This is the story of how song lyrics ended up as courtroom evidence. And this is the story of Young Thug, real name Jeffery Lamar Williams, and a case that put an entire genre of music on trial. Meanwhile, before we get to the courtroom, we need to go back to where it all began, a childhood in one of Atlanta's toughest neighborhoods. Jeffery Lamar Williams was born on August 16, 1991, in Atlanta, Georgia. He was the 10th of 11 children, raised primarily in the Jonesboro South housing projects near Cleveland Avenue, a neighborhood that would later become central to the criminal case built against him. It was also home to other future rap figures, including Waka Flocka Flame and his childhood friend Pee Wee Longway. Life in Jonesboro South was not easy. Williams has spoken about a chaotic and difficult upbringing, and by the time he reached middle school, that difficulty had already caught up with him. He was expelled in the 6th grade after breaking a teacher's arm, an incident that led to 4 years in juvenile detention. For most young people, an experience like that closes doors. For Williams, it became the backdrop of a story he would later tell through music. Music entered his life gradually. He began rapping and recording as a teenager, and by 2010 and 2011, he was releasing early tracks and mixtapes under the name Young Thug. His breakthrough came in 2013 when he signed with fellow Atlanta rapper Gucci Mane's label, 1017 Records. His debut mixtape with that label introduced the world to a voice unlike anything else in hip-hop, high-pitched, warbling, unpredictable, almost sung rather than rapped. By 2014, that voice was impossible to ignore. Singles like Stoner and Danny Glover brought him mainstream recognition, and he landed on the cover of the Fader magazine. He appeared on records with major artists across the industry, and his collaborative project with Rich Homie Quan, released under the Rich Gang name, became a defining sound of that era in Atlanta rap. What made Young Thug different wasn't just his voice. It was his willingness to break every convention. He blurred the line between singing and rapping. He wore dresses on album covers. He named songs after NBA players and Hollywood actors. Critics and fans alike didn't always know what to make of him, but nobody could deny his influence was spreading fast. By the mid-2010s, a kid from the Jonesboro South projects had become one of the most talked about new voices in American music. But his rise was only just beginning. And so, quietly, was a criminal investigation that would eventually catch up with him nearly a decade later. Because buried in the middle of his rise to fame was a single violent event from January 2015, one that prosecutors would later argue changed everything. We'll get to that. But first, let's look at just how big Young Thug actually became. Over the next several years, Young Thug didn't just join the mainstream of hip-hop. He helped redefine it. His mixtape series, including multiple volumes of Slime Season, built a devoted fan base. Full-length projects like 2019's So Much Fun debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200, cementing him as a legitimate chart-topping force, not just an underground favorite. His influence went far beyond his own songs. Artists across the genre began adopting elements of his vocal style, his ad-libs, and his unconventional song structures. Entire subgenres of modern rap, sometimes labeled mumble rap, trace a direct line back to what Young Thug pioneered in the mid-2010s. He also built an empire around him. His record label, Young Stoner Life, abbreviated YSL, signed and developed major talent, most notably the rapper Ghana. Their collaborative project, Slime Language 2, topped the Billboard charts and featured some of the biggest names in music, including Drake, Travis Scott, and Lil Baby. In 2019, Young Thug won his first Grammy Award, recognized for his contribution to Childish Gambino's politically charged single, This Is America, which won Song of the Year. It was validation from the highest levels of the industry for an artist who had once been dismissed by critics as too strained for mainstream success. Beyond music, Williams became known for his boundary-pushing fashion choices, frequently appearing in designer gowns and unconventional streetwear that challenged norms around masculinity in hip-hop. He was a fixture at award shows, a sought-after collaborator, and by every public measure, one of the most successful and influential artists of his generation. But behind the headlines about record sales and award nominations, Fulton County prosecutors had spent years quietly building a very different narrative, one that would eventually collide head-on with his career at its peak. So how does a chart-topping musician with Grammy wins and A-list collaborators end up facing dozens of felony charges? The answer starts with an investigation that had been running in the background for nearly a decade. To understand how prosecutors built their case, we have to go back to January 10th, 2015. On that day, a 26-year-old man named Donovan Thomas Jr., known by the nickname Nut, was shot and killed in a drive-by shooting outside an Atlanta barbershop. According to law enforcement, Thomas was a high-ranking member of a Bloods-affiliated group. His killing set off what prosecutors would later describe as a wave of retaliatory violence across Atlanta's South Side. Investigators allege that Young Thug personally rented the vehicle used in that 2015 shooting, and that in the years that followed, this event helped spark a bitter, violent rivalry between his associates and a rival crew. Fulton County prosecutors argue that more than 50 violent incidents followed in the months and years afterward, all connected, in their view, to conflict rooted in Thomas's death. Central to the case is the name of Young Thug's own label, YSL. Prosecutors claim that while YSL publicly stood for Young Stoner Life, it also secretly referred to Young Slime Life, which they allege was the name of a criminal street gang affiliated with the National Bloods Gang, founded around 2012. Defense attorneys have always rejected this framing entirely, insisting that YSL was simply a record label and nothing more, a group of friends and artists making music together, not a criminal enterprise. For years, this remained largely a background investigation. Law enforcement in Atlanta continued gathering evidence, surveillance, informants, social media posts, and, notably, song lyrics, building what would eventually become one of the largest and most complex racketeering cases ever filed against musicians in the United States. By 2022, Fulton County District Attorney Fonnie Willis's office believed they had enough. What had been building quietly for nearly a decade was about to become one of the most talked-about criminal cases in American music history. And when the indictment finally came, it wouldn't just name Young Thug. It would name 27 other people, including one of his own signed artists. On May 9, 2022, Young Thug was arrested in the Buckhead area of Atlanta. He was one of 28 people named in a sweeping 56-count indictment, later expanded to 65 counts, brought under Georgia's Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, commonly known as RICO. Among his co-defendants was Sergio Kitchens, better known as the rapper Ghana, one of the biggest names signed to Young Thug's own label. The news broke fast, and the reaction was immediate. Fans, fellow artists, and industry executives expressed shock. Concert dates were canceled. Business deals were paused. For an artist who has spent the better part of a decade building one of the most respected brands in hip-hop, the arrest sent shockwaves through the entire music industry. Williams was charged with conspiracy to violate the RICO Act, participation in criminal street gang activity, and drug and firearms-related offenses. He was denied bail and would remain in custody for the next 2.5 years while the case unfolded. The indictment was staggering in scope, citing 191 overt acts allegedly committed in furtherance of the criminal conspiracy, ranging from murder and armed robbery to drug trafficking. It framed Young Thug not as a musician who occasionally rapped about street life, but as the alleged leader of an organized criminal enterprise operating under cover of a record label. Many in the hip-hop community saw it differently. To them, this was an attack on artistic expression itself, an attempt to criminalize the very source material that rap music has drawn from for decades. That tension between prosecutors and defenders of creative freedom would come to define much of what followed. But to understand exactly what Young Thug was up against, you need to understand the law prosecutors chose to use against him. A law originally designed to dismantle the mafia. So what exactly is a RICO case, and why does it matter so much here? RICO stands for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The federal version was passed in 1970, originally created as a tool to dismantle organized crime families. The mafia. The idea was simple in theory. Instead of only prosecuting individual crimes one at a time, prosecutors could charge an entire group as a criminal enterprise, holding leaders responsible for crimes committed by other members of that organization, even if the leader didn't personally commit the act. Many states, including Georgia, later passed their own versions of RICO law, giving local prosecutors similar tools. Georgia's version is broader than the federal statute in some ways, making it a popular and controversial choice for prosecutors handling gang-related cases. Here's the key legal idea. If prosecutors can convince a jury that a group operates as a criminal enterprise with shared purpose, they can introduce a wide range of evidence, social media posts, associations, and yes, song lyrics, to build a pattern showing that enterprise's existence, even years after specific incidents occurred. That's exactly why this case became so unusual and so controversial. Prosecutors argued that Young Thug's own music functioned as evidence of the gang's existence and activities, treating lyrics not as art, but as admissions. Defense attorneys called this a dangerous and unprecedented conflation of creative expression with criminal confession. Legal experts and civil liberties advocates raised concerns that this approach could set a troubling precedent for musicians everywhere, regardless of genre. RICO cases are also notoriously complex to try. Because they involve alleged criminal enterprises rather than single incidents, they tend to include huge numbers of defendants, enormous volumes of evidence, and long, unpredictable trials. Critics, including defense attorneys not even connected to this case, have argued that Fulton County could have secured plea deals from many defendants years earlier without the expense and chaos of a RICO prosecution. And chaotic is putting it mildly. What happened inside that Atlanta courtroom over the following 2 years will become one of the strangest legal sagas in recent memory. Jury selection for the case began in January 2023 and took nearly a year to complete, a reflection of just how sprawling this trial would become. Opening statements finally began in November 2023, with Fulton County Chief Deputy District Attorney Adrian Love telling jurors that YSL had dominated the Cleveland Avenue community for a decade, drawing in her words, the youth, the innocence, and even the lives of some of its youngest members. Early in the proceedings, presiding Judge Earl Glanville made a pivotal ruling. Portions of Young Thug's own lyrics could be admitted as evidence. Prosecutors argued the lyrics functioned as admissions tied to real events. The defense strongly objected, arguing that treating rap lyrics as literal confessions ignored decades of artistic tradition within the genre, pointing out that other forms of music are rarely scrutinized the same way. The trial's most explosive chapter, however, centered on a single witness, Kenneth Copeland, known by the nickname Lil Woody. Prosecutors believed his testimony about a rented vehicle allegedly used in Donovan Thomas's 2015 murder would be central to their case. Instead, Copeland became evasive on the stand, at one point refusing to testify and spending a weekend in jail on a contempt charge. What happened next triggered a legal earthquake. During a break in Copeland's testimony, Judge Glanville held a private meeting in his chambers with prosecutors and Copeland, without any defense attorneys present or even aware it was happening. When defense counsel Brian Steele learned of the meeting and objected in open court, he was held in contempt and briefly taken into custody himself, a moment captured live on courtroom cameras and viewed by millions online. The fallout was severe. Defense teams for Young Thug and co-defendant Diamante Kendrick filed emergency motions arguing the secret meeting violated their client's constitutional rights. In July 2024, a separate judge agreed, ruling that, regardless of whether anything improper had actually occurred, the appearance of impropriety alone was enough to require Judge Glanville's removal from the case to preserve the public's confidence in the judicial system. It was an extraordinary outcome. The trial judge, more than a year into one of the most closely watched cases in the country, was gone. A new judge, Paige Reese Whitaker, took over the case that summer. She inherited a trial already marked by chaos, including a jailhouse stabbing of co-defendant Shannon Stillwell that had delayed proceedings months earlier, and defense attorneys repeatedly clashing with prosecutors over evidence, witness treatment, and courtroom conduct. Throughout the trial, dozens of witnesses took the stand, some cooperating, many hostile or reluctant. Prosecutors had originally indicated they might call over 300 witnesses. The defense's own witness lists included prominent names from across the music industry, illustrating just how deeply this case reached into Atlanta's hip-hop community. By late 2024, after nearly a year of testimony and mounting frustration on all sides, the case that had begun with 28 defendants had been steadily whittled down. Many had already accepted plea deals along the way, including Ghana, who pleaded guilty to one count of racketeering conspiracy in December 2022 in exchange for his release. And then in the final days of October 2024, everything changed in a single dramatic courtroom session that nobody, not even those closest to the case, fully saw coming. On October 31st, 2024, Halloween, Young Thug stood before Judge Whitaker and changed his plea. It came after prosecutors and the defense could not agree on a negotiated sentence, meaning the decision on his punishment would fall entirely to the judge. In a tense courtroom moment, Williams paused before confirming he understood the risk of what's known as a non-negotiated plea, then proceeded. He ultimately pleaded guilty to drug and firearms-related charges and entered no contest pleas to charges of conspiracy and participating in criminal street gang activity. Prosecutors had asked the court to sentence him to 45 years, with 25 to be served behind bars. Instead, Judge Whitaker handed down a sentence of 40 years total. 5 years to be served in prison, immediately commuted to time already spent in custody, followed by 15 years of probation. If Williams violates the terms of that probation, the remaining 20 years could be activated, sending him back to prison. That night, after more than 2.5 years in custody without bond, Young Thug walked free. The conditions attached to his release were extensive. He is banned from the metro Atlanta area for the first 10 years of his probation, with limited exceptions for events like weddings, funerals, or medical emergencies. He is barred from associating with other known gang members or co-defendants in the case, with 2 specific exceptions: his biological brother and longtime collaborator Ghana. He is prohibited from promoting gang activity in his music or public statements, and he is required to make anti-gang and anti-violence presentations to communities several times a year. Before addressing the courtroom, Williams spoke publicly about the case for the first time in over 2 years, telling the judge he considered himself fundamentally a good person who had found himself in difficult circumstances because of who he associated with. His co-defendants face a range of outcomes. Several who accepted plea deals in the days leading up to Williams's plea received reduced sentences involving time served or shortened prison terms. Others chose to continue fighting the charges at trial. In December 2024, after Williams's exit from the case, the remaining defendants' trial concluded with no murder convictions at all, a result legal observers described as a stunning outcome for a case prosecutors had built around alleged homicides. One defense attorney not involved in the case bluntly called it one of the biggest failures of a RICO prosecution in American history. But Young Thug's plea deal wasn't the end of his legal troubles, and what happened in the months that followed would test just how fragile his freedom really was. The YSL case didn't just affect the people directly charged. It sparked a nationwide conversation about the treatment of rap music inside the American legal system. For years, prosecutors across the country have introduced rap lyrics as evidence in criminal trials, but rarely at the scale or with this level of public attention. Many artists and industry figures spoke out during and after the trial, arguing that using lyrics as evidence unfairly targets a genre that has always drawn heavily on storytelling, exaggeration, and persona, the same artistic techniques found across nearly every other form of music, but rarely scrutinized the same way in court. Defense attorneys throughout the case leaned hard into this argument, warning that treating rap as literal autobiography, while giving other genres the benefit of artistic license, amounted to a double standard. The case also renewed debate around Georgia's RICO statute itself. Legal analysts point to the trial's chaos, the judge's recusal, the mistrial motions, the eventual lack of murder convictions for the remaining defendants, as evidence that prosecutors had overreached by pursuing such a broad racketeering theory instead of pursuing more targeted charges against specific individuals for specific crimes. At the same time, prosecutors and their supporters maintained that the case succeeded in disrupting what they viewed as a genuinely dangerous criminal organization operating in Atlanta, regardless of how the final verdicts landed. This divide between viewing the case as artistic persecution and viewing it as necessary law enforcement remains unresolved, and reasonable people continue to disagree. Beyond the courtroom, the case has already begun influencing how other prosecutors approach cases involving musicians and how defense attorneys prepare to fight back against lyric-based evidence. Some states have even considered legislation specifically limiting how creative works can be used in criminal trials, a direct response, in part, to cases like this one. So where does that leave young Thug himself, now that the cameras have moved on and the courtroom has gone quiet? Since his release in October 2024, young Thug has worked to rebuild both his career and his public image, all while navigating the strict terms of his 15-year probation. He has continued releasing new music and has slowly returned to public appearances and performances outside of the Atlanta area, which remains off-limits to him for the first decade of his probation. In an extensive interview published by GQ magazine, Williams reflected candidly on his time in custody, describing the experience as difficult, but ultimately something he believed happened for a reason. He also acknowledged that having his own lyrics used against him in court has changed how he thinks about the content of his music going forward. His legal situation hasn't been entirely free of tension since his release. In early 2025, Fulton County prosecutors filed a motion seeking to revoke his probation, alleging that certain public statements and social media activity threatened the safety of witnesses and prosecutors connected to the case. Williams, his attorney, publicly denied any wrongdoing, and the judge ultimately declined to revoke his probation, though she cautioned him to exercise more restraint going forward. Later rulings have shown some flexibility in his sentencing terms. As of this recording, if Williams remains free of violations during the first 3 years of his probation, the court has indicated he may be permitted limited return visits to Atlanta, up to 2 weeks at a time, several times a year, starting in 2027. His label, YSL Records, has continued to operate, and Williams remains an influential figure across hip-hop, even as he works from outside his hometown for the time being. Industry estimates of his net worth vary widely, reflecting the financial toll of more than 2 years without touring or new releases, along with significant legal costs. But by any measure, his position in the industry remains significant. What's clear is this: young Thug's freedom today comes with real limits. Every public appearance, every interview, every lyric he writes now carries the weight of a 15-year probationary period, and the ever-present possibility of a 20-year prison sentence hanging in the background if those terms are ever violated. So, did the YSL RICO case change hip-hop forever? In many ways. The legal questions it raised are still being worked out. Was this a necessary prosecution of a genuinely violent criminal organization hiding behind a record label? Or was it government overreach that turned song lyrics into confessions and put an entire art form on trial? Reasonable people, including experienced legal professionals, land on very different sides of that question. What isn't in dispute is the scale of what happened. 28 defendants, nearly 3 years of proceedings, a recused judge, an arrested defense attorney, dozens of plea deals, and at the center of it all, one of the most influential musicians of his generation, whose future now depends on staying within the strict boundaries of a court order. As you think about everything covered in this video, we encourage you to look at the evidence and arguments from both sides, the prosecution's case for public safety and the defense's case for artistic freedom, and come to your own conclusion. This is a story without a clean, simple answer, and it's still being written. If you found this breakdown valuable, let us know your take in the comments. Do you think this case represents justice served or a legal system overreaching into art? Hit like if you want to see more deep dives like this one, and subscribe so you don't miss our next documentary.